Hi, my name is Bob Wheeler, and welcome to the Berean Observer, where we search the scriptures daily to see whether or not these things are true. One of the leading Southern Baptist apologists on YouTube is named Leighton Flowers, and he advocates a type of theology which he calls Provisionism, and his YouTube channel is called Soteriology 101. And basically, he tries to defend what had come to be thought of as like a traditional type of theology in the Southern Baptists, among the Southern Baptists. And it's a theology which basically puts this real strong emphasis on human free will and the ability of sinners to be able to respond to the gospel on their own. And I think that there are some problems with that. One of them is that when you take a look at the membership statistics of the Southern Baptist Convention, it says that in 2024, the total membership of Southern Baptist churches was 12,722,266. But the average weekly attendance was only 4,304,625, which means that only one-third of Southern Baptists, according to the numbers, actually attend church regularly. Now, when I say that, I realize that there could be people on their membership rolls who obviously are shut-ins. They're in nursing homes. There may be people who passed away, and the local church never bothered to take them off the roll, or in some cases they may have moved away. But even still, you have to figure that at least if you go by the membership statistics, a huge number of professing Southern Baptists are nominal Christians at best, and they don't even bother to attend church. And it could be argued that this may be the result of what had come to be thought of as the traditional theology of the Southern Baptist Convention. It places a heavy emphasis on evangelism, and in so doing, there would make this there would be an assumption that the individual sinner has a free will and is capable of responding on his own to the gospel invitation. And as a result, this has led, I think, to some questionable evangelistic methods and techniques, where you have this altar call or an invitation at the end of the service while the choir is singing Just As I Am, and people are led to make professions of faith. But in some cases, it's questionable as to whether or not they've ever really come under the conviction of sin and come to a genuine repentance and faith in Jesus Christ. So along comes Leighton Flowers, and he basically wants to be a defender of what has come to be thought of as this traditional Southern Baptist theology, but he prefers to call it Provisionism, partly because he knows that when the Southern Baptist Convention was first founded, many of its founders were actually self-professed Calvinists, and that what is thought of as a traditional Southern Baptist theology actually didn't develop until like the late 19th century. So he prefers to call his theology Provisionism. And what he means by that is that God simply makes the provision of salvation, makes it available to the entire human race, and then he leaves it up to individual sinners to decide out of their own free will whether or not they wish to accept it. And basically on his YouTube channel, he's constantly attacking Calvinism. And in so doing, I should mention, he has a website as well, Soteriology 101. And the website has a chart that shows basically what make up the basic provisions of Provisionism. And so we'll be looking at that. But basically, he on his YouTube channel, he's constantly attacking Calvinism. And I think a big part of the problem is he's not really an exegete. He hasn't really kept up with his Greek. And instead, he's a debater. His background is in debating. And as a result, he tends to think in terms of nice, neat, logical systems of thought. And so what he'll do is he'll try to force his opponents into what he thinks are the logical consequences of their thinking. And he winds up making every Calvinist out to be a hyper-Calvinist that believes that God sends people to hell because he decreed from all eternity that they wouldn't have the ability to respond to the gospel. And that hardly does justice to what probably the majority of professing Calvinists actually think. And but at any rate, so the way they put it here in is the provisionism thing there. So basically what we want to take a look at is this whole idea of human ability, or on the Calvinist side what we call total depravity. And the real question is, what does the Bible itself actually say? Now, the way he puts it here on his provisionism chart, he says that it's under the R, responsible, and he says that everyone is able to respond to God's appeals for reconciliation because a divine provision will be heard and understood. Now, it's a little vague as to exactly what he means there when he says that a divine provision has been made, because hopefully nearly every Christian would argue that, well, God has certainly provided the gospel. He provided the death of Christ on the cross. He's provided the scriptures. He sends preachers out into the world. And so, God has provided. But he says everyone is able to respond. And that implies that there's nothing innate in human nature that would prevent anyone from actually responding to the message once they hear it. So what we want to do is look at what the Bible says. What does the Bible actually say? How does the Bible describe the condition of a lost sinner? That's the key question. So what we want to do is begin by looking at a passage in Romans chapter 1. And I think it's kind of significant that Romans is probably Paul's most extensive and explicit presentation of the Christian gospel that you'll find anywhere in the New Testament. And it's interesting because Paul begins his discussion of the gospel by looking at human sinfulness and depravity. And so in Romans chapter 1, verses 18 through 23, and reading from the New King James Version, here's what he says. For the wrath of God is revealed from heaven against all ungodliness and unrighteousness of men, who suppress the truth in unrighteousness. Because what may be known of God is manifest in them, for God has shown it to them. For since the creation of the world, his invisible attributes are clearly seen, being understood by the things that are made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. Because although they knew God, they did not glorify him as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became fools. Now, this is an interesting passage because you're thinking in terms of human ability and whether or not sinners can respond to the gospel. It's almost like Paul says that sinners are condemned because they know, but then they don't respond to the gospel because they don't know. And so you wonder how that is. First of all, the passage makes it clear that sinners are capable of knowing that God exists in verses 19 and 20. And I actually don't care for the way that the New King James Version translates this, and even most other modern versions. The way I would translate it would be, my own literal translation, would be, for his invisible attributes are discerned clearly from the creation of the world, being perceived in what was made, even his eternal power and Godhead, so that they are without excuse. And I think the trick here is that the word creation, or the Greek word ktisis, can either mean the act of creation or the thing created. And I think that a lot of these, the New King James Version and a lot of other translations, take it in the sense of it's the act of creation. So they argue since the creation of the world. And I think that when you look at the context, that doesn't make a whole lot of sense. And what Paul is really doing here is that he's making an argument from design. He's saying that a rational, intelligent person should be able to look at the creation, what was actually created, and reasonably conclude that there had to have been an intelligent creator behind all of this. Things like this just simply don't happen by themselves, purely by accident. And that's why God's judging them, because they're without excuse. They should be able, they have the mental capacity to be able to do that, to draw that conclusion, and yet they don't. Instead, he says that they suppress the truth in unrighteousness. They deny the truth of what they actually know. They'll take a look at the creation with all of its complexity and all of its structure and immensity, and then try to conclude that this all came about through a blind, impersonal, natural process. And what it is that they inwardly should be able to know the truth about that God is the creator, and yet they wind up denying it and come up with a theory of evolution. And as a result of this tendency to just to suppress the truth, they wind up becoming spiritually ignorant. So Paul says here They did not glorify him God as God, nor were thankful, but became futile in their thoughts, and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing to be wise, they became foolish. And here again, when it says that it says, that they were futile in their thoughts. In other words, their thinking didn't lead to valid conclusions. They could think things and not come to the right conclusion. It says their foolish hearts were darkened. They could not see or think clearly about spiritual reality. And it says, professing to be wise, they became fools. They could be very, very well-educated people. They can have earned doctorates, PhDs, and yet when it comes to basic things about, the nature of reality, spiritual reality, and they wind up becoming fools. They can't come up with the truth. And then it says in verse 23, and they changed the glory of God, the glory of the incorruptible God, into an image made like corruptible man, and birds and four-footed animals and creeping things. And of course, at this point, Paul's describing the Gentiles of the Greco-Roman world in his day, which resulted in idolatry and polytheism. But even though we don't bow down or worship, graven images the way they did, there's a certain sense in which once you exclude God and you get rid of him, then you have to replace him with something else. And typically what we do is we replace it with politics, sex, money, drugs, alcohol, and so on. Those are the things that we try to find meaning and purpose in, and those are the things in all effect that become our substitute gods. So then the question is, okay, so why would a reasonably intelligent person, especially an educated person, want to suppress the truth? I mean, that doesn't make any sense at all. You would think that you'd want to know the truth, the reality of things. Well, if you go over to Ephesians chapter 4, Paul gives us kind of an intriguing description of human psychology. And he tells in Ephesians chapter 4, starting with verse 17, he says, "This I say, therefore, and testify in the Lord, that you should no longer walk as the rest of the Gentiles walk, in the futility of their mind, having their understanding darkened, being alienated from the life of God, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart, who, being past feeling, have given themselves over to lewdness, to work all uncleanness with greediness." So in other words, what he's saying here is that the underlying problem is the condition of the human heart. And it says in verses 18, and it says, because of the ignorance that is in them, because of the blindness of their heart. And again, the word that's translated blindness is literally, it means hardness. In fact, it's the Greek word porosis. And so the idea is that their heart is not right. In other words, they don't believe the truth because they don't want to believe the truth. They've made up their minds in advance that they're going to live their lives independently of God, and they're not going to acknowledge God as the one true God as their creator and source and sustainer of life. And as a result, it says that their understanding is darkened. They simply they misinterpret reality and arrive at false conclusions. And then this results from their being alienated from God, so that even though they were created by God, they owe their very existence to him. They have no relationship with him at all in terms of any kind of interpersonal communication that goes on. And then this in turn results in them giving themselves over to all kinds of sin in actual practice. And so he talks about lewdness, which is like licentiousness or wantonness. He talks about uncleanness, which would be morally filthy and disgusting behavior. He talks about greediness. People are just out to get whatever they can for themselves. So basically what happens in actual practice is that the sinners are motivated by self-centered desires. They give themselves over to sinful activity. Back in the Roman days, they say wine, women, and song. Today we say sex and drugs and rock and roll. Okay? So what it boils down to then is that the underlying problem is with the human heart. And as a result, the unregenerate sinner is incapable of responding to the gospel on his own. And it's possible to say that he has a natural ability, he has the mental capacity to be able to look at creation and draw the valid conclusion that it had to have been made by an intelligent supreme being. But he has a moral inability. He doesn't have the will to respond to the truth and accept the gospel. So basically, I think that Leighton Flowers grossly underestimates the nature of human depravity. And I think that this has some severe understandings of repercussions for our understanding of the new birth. The question is, what exactly does it mean to be born again? And unless you understand the condition of the natural sinner and the natural condition of a fallen sinner and what the Holy Spirit does to change him and bring him to Christ, then you're probably going to have a very weak and faulty understanding of the new birth. And as we go on in the weeks to come to further explore Leighton Flowers' theology, we'll see that that's exactly the problem that he has. And I think that for the practical implications of all of this is that, first of all, we all need to come to a deeper understanding of the fact of what we were as lost and fallen sinners. I think the problem is that as human beings, we tend to judge ourselves by the standards of society. So as long as we stay clean of the law, we have good reputations in our community, we don't get arrested, we're not serving jail time, we assume we pat ourselves on the back and we assume that we're basically decent human beings. But what we need to do is to see ourselves the way God sees us. God is omniscient, and he looks on the human heart, and he sees the underlying motives. And he sees the greed, the lust, the pride, the anger, the selfishness. A lot of times people will do the right things outwardly for the wrong wrong reasons inwardly. They're looking for the applause of their fellow men instead of having a genuine love for God and a genuine love for their fellow human beings. And God sees all of that. He knows exactly what's going on inside the human heart, and he's angry with human beings because of it. And then for those of us who are saved, we need to have a deeper appreciation of the love and grace that God has shown to us. It's a fascinating passage of Romans chapter 5, starting with verse 6. It says, "For when we were still without strength, in due time Christ died for the ungodly. For scarcely for a righteous man will one die, yet perhaps for a good man someone might surely die. But God demonstrates his love and love toward us, in that while we were still sinners, Christ died for us." And I think that's what's striking here is that is for whom he died. It says it was for whom God loved. It was basically while we were still sinners. We were completely unworthy. And I think it's important to say here that when it says that God demonstrates his love, the English word love can mean a variety of things. But here it doesn't mean that God thinks that we're just really great people and he just loves us to death. What it means is that he's showing pity and compassion on us, and he's looking at us in our fallen condition, ruined and distressed by sin, and decides to do it. So then what does he do to demonstrate his love? It says that Christ died for us. He made the supreme sacrifice on the cross, went through a horrible agony, and in order to atone for our sin and make it possible for us to be reconciled to God. And it's almost hard for us to conceive how God could do something like that, or that Christ could do something like that, and yet he did, for our sakes. And what greater love is imaginable, and as a result, we should be eternally grateful to Christ for what he's done. So we'd ask that you think about these things and carefully reflect on it, and Lord willing, we'll see you the next time. Bye now.